Welcome back to Blender for Blogs. I'm Justin with another tutorial here for you all about using Blender's video editor to edit videos for your blogs. If you're just tuning in and want to know more about the series, you can click on the cards above or on the links in the description. But for those of you who have been following along, we have completed phase 1 and now we are moving to phase 2, which is all about removing our green screen. So you can see here in the first part of my promo video that I did, we have a green screen here. Now in this particular video, we're not going to learn about that wipe. We will learn about that in phase 3, so don't worry. But what we're going to focus on here is taking this green screen you see and removing it just like that. And then later in phase 3, we'll add a background as well. Now, if you don't have a green screen, well, lucky you for 2 reasons actually. Because first, you get to skip this step if you want, if you don't have one, and save yourself a whole bunch of time. And you just jump to phase 3 and you're good to go. But let's say you don't have a green screen, but you still want to follow along. Well, you are also in luck because on my website, I have just added the pre-cut render of my footage that I did in phase 1. So just go over to blenderfrenzy.com, go over to the sidebar, put your name and email, check this by opting in. I agree to receive news and updates from Blender Frenzy. And then in parentheses, it says, don't worry, no spam, I promise, which is true. I don't like sending a lot of emails. It will send you an email that looks something like this. So just click this yes, subscribe me to this list, and then you'll be taken to a page that will show you a password. All you have to do is copy that password and then go to the Frenzy Freebies here, which is also, there's a link on the page. You'll also be receiving the password and the links and everything in a second email after you confirm your subscription. But take that and just paste it into here like this and enter, and voila, we have the Frenzy Freebies. So you can get your cheat sheet, which has all the shortcuts and the setup I use for Blender, key configuration if you want to download mine, and then down here you can see pre-cut footage for phase 2 editing green screen removal. Now again, this is the pre-cut footage that we just finished from phase 1. So that might be helpful if you didn't want to go through phase 1 because you already know how to use Blender Video Editor, but you want to learn more about green screening. Here you go. Okay, one more thing before I get started, I do want to give a shout out to some people who I've learned a great deal from when it comes to removing green screens in Blender, as well as video editing in general. First up is Oliver Villar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry, Oliver. Oliver Villar. This one particularly right here, the green screen removal and light wrap, is excellent video. He also does some general video editing, but just a whole bunch of stuff here that he's got. Next up is Alamayo. Alamayo. I don't know. Again, I'm sorry. I'm terrible at pronouncing names. But here you go. How to key an uneven green screen. He's got a couple other green screen tutorials that, VFX type stuff. It's really cool. He's also got a ton of modeling stuff. So if you're into modeling, I definitely check out him. Then we've got Film Riot, which you may have heard of. Film Riot's got some cool green screen removal videos. And of course, if you are familiar with Film Riot, they've got a whole bunch of different things when it comes to video editing, but they don't use Blender. So this is just, I think they use the Adobe Creative Suite, but all of the same kind of techniques, you can do the same kind of things in Blender if you're kind of familiar with how to do them. Last up is Mikey Kalmeyers, and he's got a whole bunch of great video editing if you're, again, intro to video editing stuff. So this is where I learned a lot of the stuff I'm teaching. So definitely check him out. Okay, without further delay, let's get back into Blender. I've opened up the B4B Demo 0203, which is what we use to render our video from. Here is our Cut 2, where we did all of our tweaks to our Cut 1, and we rendered it. So we have original Cut 1 and Cut 2. The very first thing I'm going to do is save it. So Control-Shift-S to save it as, and I'm going to change this to 301, enter, enter, and then I'm going to do it again, Control-Shift-S, and then bump that up to 302 again, because I like to have the last one I worked on and the first one of the new version or the new series to be identical. Just personal preference. So I'm just going to create another iteration, 302. And the very next thing I'm going to do before I do anything else is I'm going to change the output name from our rendered that we've already done to 302, which is the name of our current file. And that is because if I accidentally press the animation button, it's going to automatically overwrite any video file that has the same name. And even if I accidentally hit it for a split second, it's all over. Because even if it doesn't finish rendering and I hit stop, the process has already begun. I've now replaced my full render with a, half a second accidental push of that button. And it doesn't matter if I check this box or not, and I don't know why, but you can see that's grayed out. Doesn't matter if I have it override or not, it will override it. So changing that name is crucial so that if I accidentally hit an animation, it will start a new file. It's also a good idea to make a copy of your final render after you render it. In case that does happen and you forget to change the name, you always have a backup copy to work from. And I highly recommend making several backups. Okay, so we're ready to remove our green screen, but before we do that, I need to show you the three sources that Blender renders from. And this is very important because it's very confusing if you don't know what's going on. And in order to get an accurate, what you expect to be rendered, it's good to know what sources Blender is pulling from. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a quick full copy here. I'm not even going to rename it. I'm going to go over to O2 Just Compositing. And we see from what we set up before, we have our video sequence editor down here, which is what we were just looking at. And if I go over to post-processing, uncheck sequencer, and then down to render, and then hit the render single frame, you see nothing happened. Well, something did happen actually, but we have to make sure we display it. So hit this icon here and then choose render result, and then that will display, voila, a nice looking 3D cube. And that is very different from what we would expect to render from our preview here. Now we unchecked the sequencer, which is what this is. So we kind of maybe knew that it wasn't going to render that, but why did it render this? Well, it's because the default render is the 3D view, because Blender is primarily a 3D software program. So if I go to my default 3D view here, you can see that the camera, here's the camera, and it is pointing right at this 3D cube. And if I look in the camera and I turn this to rendered, that's the view that you're actually getting. So going back to our compositing, without the other options checked, compositing or sequencer, it will automatically render the 3D view. So now let's come back over to our node editor, which is this. Should be right here if you don't have it. And then select Use Nodes. And once you do that, you see two nodes appear. We have our render layers and we have our composite node. You see the render layer has the same image in it. It's because that's what this is. This is pulling from the 3D view, our default 3D view. And then it's running into our compositor node, which is this here. So if we check that, and then we hit render, it will render our cube, and then it will feed it through the compositor node, and it will display it here. Now, if I take this button here, click and drag and release to disconnect these two nodes, you can see now I have a black render result. And if I hit render again, you see something happened with the cube, and then it went black again. And that is because it's first rendering the 3D view, and then it's rendering the compositor node. And since nothing is connected to the compositor node, it's just black. So you have a black image, which is what it outputs here. So those are your three sources. You have your 3D view or your render layers. You have your composite node, which is here. And you have your sequencer, which is here if you check that. Now, if you check the sequencer and hit render, like Homestyle 10 says, hit render, it will override everything else and render the sequencer. So it doesn't really matter what is connected or selected. If sequencer is checked, it's going to override everything else. So those are the three sources that Blender pulls from when it renders. And that is how you can determine what is being rendered and make sure that you get a predictable result. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that it will help you kind of think about what's connected and what's not connected and what will be rendered. I'm going to go ahead and just hit X here to get rid of that and go back to our Cut 2 and our video editing here. I'm going to make another copy, but instead of full copy this time, I'm going to copy the settings. And then I'm going to rename this to Greenscreen because we're moving right along. So you can see it's copied all of the video editor settings, but it has not copied the files or any of the objects or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and add in our rendered video. Okay, and before I pull it in, I'm actually just going to control and click on it so I can rename it. I'm going to rename it to phase 1 underscore precut underscore footage dot mp4. Enter, and then double click, and it's added it in. Hovering over the sequencer, I'm going to hit home and scroll out a little bit. Now it's added it here in the middle because that's where my timeline cursor is. To fix this, just shift left arrow or hit this button down here, jump to first. And with the two strips selected, shift S to snap that to the cursor. And now you can see because our render is an exact same frame range as our Cut 2, fits perfectly in there. I'm just going to grab this, move that up because it's my personal preference. You can do whatever you want there. And we're going to go ahead and go over to our compositing now. And here's our preview. Again, I'm just using this for reference. So I'm just going to really crank this down here just because I want more space over here. If I uncheck the sequencer here, I'm going to check the compositing here and then check use nodes. And we have our render layers again and our composite. And by the way, this is called post-processing again because the compositor and the sequencer are done after the render layer. So the render layers first, then the compositor, then the sequencer. But I brought it to the top because since we don't need the 3D view, it's actually just going to be our regular processing. So what I'm going to do is select the render layers, hit X to delete that since we don't need it. And then I'm going to add in an input movie clip. Then I'm going to click open and then double click on our footage, which is a separate instance. It's the same file, but it's the separate instance. So this instance and this instance of the file is in our sequencer is going to be different because they're working off of different sources again. So I'm just going to drag this image button from the movie clip editor to the composite, just like that, and you can see nothing happened. So let's click render, and there we go. So now it's displaying what's in here down here. And that's only if you have that render result. So make sure you click your render result there. Now, if I disconnect this, which I can either click and drag and pull that out, or hit Control and then left mouse button and drag and cut that just like that, you see it turns black. And that's because, again, you just have a black image here. Nothing is being fed through this. And you can change the color here, and then that will change what you see in the render. And that's what your final render will look like. I'm actually going to change this to like a hot pink color. And this is just to tip me off later down the road that if I don't actually have it connected properly and I start seeing this hot pink in the render result, I know something has gone wrong. But with all this talk about the compositor node, I'm actually not going to use that right now. While we do our editing, I'm going to use a different node called, if you go to the output viewer node. And then connect these up together like that, and nothing happens. So let's hit render, and nothing happens again. We're still getting that pink, and that's because we're still displaying our render result here. So let's click this, and now that we've added a viewer node, we have a viewer node option. So let's display the viewer node. And the reason we're doing this is because it's a lot easier to connect nodes up to the viewer node. So if I do Control and then drag that through again, in order to connect to the viewer node, all I have to do is Control, Shift, and then click on a node, and it will automatically add it to the viewer node. And you can click around on a whole bunch of different nodes really quickly. Now, if that doesn't work for you, that's because you need to go to your user preferences, go to your add-ons, type node, and enable your node wrangler if you don't have that checked. Because the node wrangler will allow you to do a whole bunch of cool things with nodes, just like that. So I'm going to also add in here an input image. And you can add in any image you want. I'm actually just going to open up the beach background. Let's see, where is that? Right. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to Control Shift and click on this one. And now you can see that the viewer node is showing this. I can just go back and forth. If I just hold Control Shift down, just go back and forth between those. I can also just keep clicking on the same node to cycle through the buttons. So that's pretty cool. And it's so much faster. So if you have a whole bunch of different nodes here, clicking between those is going to save you a lot of time rather than keep dragging these to the compositor node. Then when we're finished and we're satisfied with the viewer node, we will click and we will move that to our final composite. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. So I know you're probably itching to get right onto our removing our green screen, but I want to show you one thing first, and that's going to be the backdrop workflow. So I'm going to hover over the node editor, Shift Spacebar to maximize that view. And this is the workflow a lot of people like to use. And so if I come down here and click backdrop, whatever is fed through the viewer node here is going to be in the backdrop. By the way, I'm sorry if I didn't mention this before, but navigating the nodes is pretty much similar to navigating the sequencer. Just scroll in and out, and then middle mouse button to drag and pan that. To adjust the background, you can come over to the properties over here, and then here's your zoom. You can offset it on the X or the Y axis. You can click move and then move it that way. You can fit it or reset it. A couple of hotkeys are V as in Victor to zoom out and Alt V to zoom in. And this would be a great workflow to use if I didn't have to constantly move and zoom in and zoom out. So if this was just static here, this would be perfect. Then I could just, mess with my nodes and see the effect that it has. But I'm actually not going to use this workflow because I have to move the background too much and it's a little wooden with these controls. So I'm going to Shift Spacebar out of that, uncheck backdrop, move this up, and kind of position this a little bit like that. So I'm going to show you the image editor workflow. And basically, it's just that. So we're just going to be navigating our backdrop through here. And you can just scroll in with your mouse wheel and then pan with your middle mouse and drag just like normal. Okay, so we are now ready to remove our green screen. So let's go. Hover over the node editor, Shift A, and add in a matte keying node. And that gives you this long node here. If you hover over the connector between the movie clip and the viewer, it changes color. If I click, it will automatically put those into the proper buttons, the image buttons there. And after I did that, you can kind of see here that it's already doing something, but it's keying out the wrong color. So we're going to have to change that color. But instead of changing it here in our node and kind of scrolling in and scrolling out, which can be a little tedious, I'm just going to probably keep it in maybe about there. And then I'm going to pull this out. And I'm going to close all of these and just open the properties. And whatever node I have selected, it will show the properties of that node. So I'm going to select the keying node, and it shows all the properties here. And the first thing I'm going to change is the key color. So I'm going to click the white little square here. And I could manually do this and kind of drag it on a shade of green or green, yellow, whatever. And you can kind of see it's doing something there. But that's not really what I want. So Control Z to undo that and select the eyedropper tool instead, and then click over here in a brighter area. And you can see that has a similar effect, but we're starting to eliminate more of that green in the background. But as you can see, we've got this leftover like dirt, gross color all over, which is not what we want. And the reason for that is I'm going to shift click our movie clip here so that we can go to our original view. And you can see that my green screen is not evenly lit and it's very wrinkly. It starts off light here and it goes dark here. Well, Blender actually can take care of this really well. If I go back over to my keying, but it handles it well with a darker green color. So if I just take this brightness down, you can start to see that it starts getting rid of most all of our green screen, which is really cool. Now, another way to do that is probably a better way is if I bring this down to black and then bring it all the way up to white again. Come on, white, just like we had it before. And then select the eyedropper, and instead of clicking on a white area, let's click on a dark area down here in the corner. So one of the darkest areas there, and right away you can see that has kind of the intended effect we want. And I'm even going to pull that down just a little bit more. So we get the proper shade and the proper brightness. So that's actually already looking pretty decent. Now you're going to have to adjust your key color depending on the kind of footage you have and depending on your green screen and how well it's lit. But just mess around with that and see if you can get it to where it's eliminating most of it. Even if you can't eliminate all of it, we can adjust it later. But the key color has a lot to do with the initial removal. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these other properties here and see what they do. Just kind of test them out. So we've got this pre-blur up here. I'm just going to start cranking that up. And you can see that kind of effect that has kind of eats into the image there. Let's put that back to 0. And let's do screen balance, see what that does. Crank that up. Not seeing really anything happen there. But if I crank it down, see it really has an effect. Yeah, that looks gross. Control Z to get that back to there. And the dispill factor, you can also drag this and then just, instead of releasing it, just click the right mouse button or the left, no, the right mouse button, the opposite mouse button that you're using to drag these, and it will cancel that action. So you can see the dispill factor here. And what this does is you can see that green around the edges. And basically that's because it's spilling off of the background. Since I'm standing so close to the backdrop, it spills onto the edges of my silhouette here. And you can see it's kind of in the hair as well. So that's what this dispill thing does. And here's the dispill balance. So this was all the way at 1, I believe, which looks good. But if I crank that up, you can still see some of that green being spilled onto me. But if I crank it down, you can see I look like an Oompa Loompa. All the green is out of the picture there. Some sort of weird creature from Guardians of the Galaxy or something. So I'm just going to put this up. I'm not going to put it back to where it was. I'm just probably down right before it gets to purpley. Yeah, right there. Okay, I'm going to skip the edge and the clip for now. We're just going to go down to dilate erode. So if I go into the negatives, you can see that it's going to erode away from the edges there. Like that. And if I go out, it's going to have the opposite effect. So just change that back to 0. The feather distance, it's kind of the same concept. It's like feathering in if you're used to like Photoshop or something. And you can change the fall off here for the feather. So that's going to affect a lot of our edges there. So keep that at smooth for now. And then last here we've got post blur. And that only goes out. So that has a similar effect to our feather. But we're going to be using all of these in combination with each other to get a nice smooth edge without any of the green showing or any artifacts and sparkling around the edges or whatever you call that. Okay, so let's take a look at the node itself and see what's actually going on here. So we've got 3 buttons here. We've got image, matte, and edges. So let's Control-Shift-Click to go to our matte. And you can see here we've got a black and white image, and this is our mask. So everything in white is going to be shown, and everything in black is going to be cut out. And this is where our clip black and white come in to play. The clip black and white is similar to the levels tool in Photoshop or in GIMP. If you take the clip black and you kind of crank that up, it takes all the black areas and makes them as solid black as possible. And same thing with the white, it's going to take all the white areas and make it solid white as possible. So no gray areas in between. And that is what we want, because we want this mask here of the subject to be all white, and we want everything else to be black. So we want to make sure we adjust those to nothing is bleeding through, and we'll adjust those a little bit more later. The next thing is the edges. So let's go there, and you can see now the edge detection. So the radius, the edge radius, is going to be how thick those edges are. Bring that back down to 3. And the tolerance is going to be its ability to detect edges from non-edges. So right now we have here, it's thinking this is an edge, and some parts of my shirt are edges, which is not what we want. So let's kind of crank that up to see if we can start getting rid of some of that here. Yeah, so we don't want to crank that too high because I think it affects some other things, but just you can kind of see what's happening there. And maybe put that up to 4. Yeah. Okay, so I want to say that giving attention to these 2 things, the matte and the edges, are going to make the biggest difference on whether your video looks amateur or professional. For a professional look, you don't want it to be obvious that you're using a green screen, and so you want to spend a good amount of time and attention getting these 2 options right, these 2 settings right. But let's clean up our background a little because we don't want the sides to have any white on them either. We want a complete black background. So we are going to add in a box mask right over here. So Control A, matte, box mask. And then connect that box mask, the box mask right up to the garbage matte input here on our keying node. And you can see there's a little box in the middle of the screen that cuts out my neck. So let's go back to our image, and this is what it's doing. And this is having the exact opposite of what we want. So we want everything inside of the box to stay and everything outside to be cut out. So we're going to have to add in a color invert node and drop it right in there. And there we go. It inverts it to where everything inside the box stays. Of course, we're going to have to adjust the box now. And this is one of the only times that I use the backdrop workflow. So hover over the node editor, shift spacebar, and come in here and hit backdrop. Okay, and now, see if I zoom out by hitting V a couple of times, I can select the box mask, and it's actually going to show me a white outline where that box mask is. But I'm going to connect our movie clip to our viewer and then select the box mask so that I can see how I need to adjust this to our green screen. So here, up here in our properties, we can adjust the width, and we can adjust the position here. Now that goes really fast. If you hit Shift while you move that, it slows it down a bit so you can get a little bit more accurate. I'm going to do 0.485, I think. Yeah, there we go. And then the height doesn't have to be that accurate because we're using the full height there. So something like that. And now if we connect our keying node back up to our viewer, we can see, voila, we have successfully eliminated the sides from our background. And if we look at our matte, we have a perfect black background so far. Now we've got to adjust, see, I can't zoom in. We've got to adjust, Alt V is zooming in here, that there. Okay, and that is it on the backdrop workflow. So Shift Spacebar to go back out, and we need to adjust our clipping here. So let's go do that. Now to help us out with that, I'm actually going to move these out just a little bit here. And I'm going to add in a color alpha over. And I'm going to put it right there, and it turns everything white. And why is that? Well, if you look at our image, well, let's actually make sure our image is actually being put in there. So if we look at our alpha over node, we can see two image buttons here, and this acts as layers. But the problem is that the layers act exactly opposite of every other compositing software. So like Photoshop, the top layer image overlays on the bottom layer image. This is not so with Blender. It is the bottom image that overlays on top of the top image. So we have to switch these. So if I switch this one to here, now we have our image, our keying image, over the top of our white background. I have no idea why that's the case. It's really confusing, but it is as if you were looking from the bottom up. So we got the image on top of that one. Now also make sure you click Convert Pre-Multiply, and I'm going to actually just crank this down to maybe here, and then change it maybe to a different color like blue. Okay, and now you can see maybe a brighter color actually, like red, and brighten that up. And yellow. Let's do yellow or orange. Nope. Let's do. I just want to be able to see it in my face and in my clothing. Okay. You can see it's bleeding through here and obviously up here. So that's going to help with a lot of our options and our clipping. So let's start with the clipping. I'm going to adjust this clip black. Okay, so cranking that up really isn't what we want. So let's crank that down, and that's actually having a better effect there. And our white, see if we start clipping our white all the way down. We still got some of that showing here. Okay, we're gonna have to probably edit another setting. Let's try our edge kernel tolerance. Okay, that does have some sort of an effect. It's not exactly. Let's bring that down. And you can see, take a look at our edges as well. Okay, so I'm just going to crank our pre-blur up, and that looks like that it helps a little bit here. Let's check our matte. Okay, yeah, that's pretty solid white all over. We've got solid black on the outside. It's just good. Creating our mask. And basically from here on out is just tweaking these settings in our keying node. And just making sure we have a nice smooth edge. So green screen removal could take 5 minutes, or it could take several hours or several days. It all just depends on your footage and the way you light your green screen, the settings that you choose, and just how detailed and how professional you want it to look. So here's a tip that I got from Andrew Price, you know, the Blender guru guy. I'm sure you're familiar with him. But he said that the professionals will, like when they're making movies, like in Hollywood, they'll crank these up to their maximums and their minimums. So they'll go to the extremes with all of these and just see what is being produced by doing all of those. You can see your limitations, but it also might produce some really cool results that you weren't necessarily expecting, and you might be like, oh, actually, that works better. I'll go with that. So that I would recommend that while you're getting used to what all of these options do is just kind of crank them in their maximum and minimums. So let's see if I can remember how I had this before. Clip, just make sure that that's all good there. Okay. And so basically the rest of the time here, I'm just going to make sure this edge is nice and smooth. And see, I did a lot of changes here. And hair is really difficult to get that edge right. Let's see. Just really boring stuff right now. But yep, just kind of adjusting that. Let's go down here and do some feather adjustments here. I don't like that. Let's bring that tolerance down. There we go. So what I'm looking for basically is trying to get a smooth edge without a lot of jaggediness and not a lot of fuzziness, but not too faded. Here. Oh, what's also good is to start clicking through the timeline here. I'm going to hit home and just see different poses and see if all the edges are going to be working well with that. And I still don't like that up here on the hair. Maybe if our clipping here is not good enough. Ew, that's gross. That's all right there. Let's do post blur here. All right, that might be too fuzzy. Let's do no feathering. Oh, it's not looking too bad actually now. Just look at some other frames here. Oh, and motion frames are actually really good too if you have motion on that green screen. Trying to find a frame where I'm motioning on the green screen. Oh well, I think it'll be fine. Oh, I don't like that. what can we do with that? Let's do a little bit of erosion there, a little bit of feather. Yeah, that's not working either. Don't want to crank that down too much. I mean, that looks good there. Yeah, actually not looking too bad on there either. Oh, that's a lovely view there. Oh! Okay, let's see here. Let's do a different frame. Yeah. Well, that might be a little bit weird. Because it's hard to tell with still frames, but once it starts moving, you can definitely see like if you have like jaggedy edges and things like that. And the hair really is kind of bothering me there. Well, that would really be weird. Just make sure we haven't lost any of that clipping there. That's probably going to be about as subtle as I can get it. We may have to tweak it later. But let's do, I want to see what it looks like on this image. So I'm going to just take this image that we imported earlier and put it right where the purple is, or the pink, or the hot pink, whatever. See what that looks like. Yeah, so that doesn't look too bad. Like that. All right, but you can see that the image and the video clip are different sizes. So in order to fix that, let's just drag these out here a little bit. And what we're going to do is add in a distort scale node, and I'm going to drop it right here. And here's our settings here. Let's go over here for our properties. You can set it to relative, absolute, scene size, or render size. So I'm going to set it to render size. So it's going to scale the movie clip according to the dimensions that I have here. So I need to get the background image to do the same. So with the scale node selected, Shift D to duplicate, and then just drop it right on there. And there we go. The image is now the same dimensions as our movie clip. So that looks all right. Very, very last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to disconnect the background image. I'm going to take that color, move it all the way down to black, and once again, just kind of double check the edges there. And you can kind of see the armpits have a little bit of white in them. This happens when you have like, especially with clothing, and you have the clothing kind of, the flaps of the clothing up against each other. That doesn't bother me too much. If that bothers you too much, you can, tweak it and change it. But I think it's good for now. Most people don't notice that anyway. Okay, so with this color being black, I'm going to take the alpha, which is the transparency, and crank that all the way down. And we have our image here. Oh, and another thing you can do to see if it gives you a better result is take the matte and put it into the factor of the alpha over. And then check your edges to see if that does, if you like that better or worse than what you had it before. And I don't like it as much, so at least not initially here. So I'm going to keep that off. All right, so that is it. We have successfully removed our green screen. The next step is to render it out into an image sequence, so I will see you in the next video for that. Oh, and don't forget to save your progress. So save, iteration save. All right, see you in the next one.